welcome to Module 10 about legacy planning. We're going to focus on what happens to the land after you. So why do we think about legacy planning? Why in this context? And we're really looking at this space of forest landowner future plans and needs. When you look at the data from the National Woodland Owner Survey, we know that nationally about 2.7 million family forest owners, so people, individuals, partners, spousal units that own land, are over 55 years old, which represents 80% of all family-owned forest land in properties that are 10 acres of size and larger. And so we see, based on that data, that almost 1/3 of the landowners, especially in the Northeast and the Eastern US, where the majority of the forest is privately held, we see many of those folks planning to make decisions or being forced to make decisions in the next 5 years. We know that land is at risk when it changes hands, whether that be through inheritance or sale. And so the decisions that current owners are making, or the non-decisions that they're making by virtue of not making any decisions, are really going to determine what happens to the land. Is it going to be developed? Is it going to be parcelized? Will it be unchanged? Will it be protected in some form or fashion? Looking at some data from Pennsylvania, we've asked a lot of questions over the years about what landowners are doing or plan to do with their forest land in the future. So this data is reflected from a 2010 survey that we did that included some questions about future plans. And so almost a quarter of the landowners said they plan to sell the forest land as it currently is. 14% were going to use some of the estate planning tools that I'm going to talk about in a little bit, trust to protect the land in some form or fashion. 4% were planning a conservation easement, another land protection tool. 40% of our forest landowners in Pennsylvania have a will, which is higher than the average across all American citizens, but only 9% have something like an estate plan, which we're going to talk about more. So those tools and strategies that I'm going to cover in this presentation are not widely used by folks in thinking about land and how it is transferred across generations or from one owner to another. Interestingly, where many of our landowners have more than one beneficiary or child, many landowners in Pennsylvania plan to leave their forest land to all their children in that regard. And for many folks, for many people who have siblings, we know that process of managing the land, of caring for the land, of ensuring that land's continuity, that wood's forest continuity, is largely dependent upon those interpersonal relationships between the owners. And so we recognize that is a space where some challenges may arise. I include this quote down at the bottom from a book written by two financial planners who worked with families who had philanthropic organizations, so families with enough wealth to have family philanthropies. And in their work with those families, they saw about a 70% rate of failure in transferring assets and wealth across generations. And these were families with tons of resources and tons of the ability to get help. So we know that this is a very challenging space to work in. It's challenging for the current owners to think about. It's challenging for their beneficiaries to think about what happens to the land when their parents or aunts and uncles or grandparents are gone. But we also know that it's really important in terms of thinking about land conservation. Another study that we've done in Pennsylvania specifically asked more questions about that planning for the future. And what we see across all of our studies, across national and state studies, majority of our forest landowners want to keep the forest land in the family. So we know that's really important. That's a high value for many people. But only a quarter of them are talking to their beneficiaries about that plan. Another quarter said they wanted it to stay that way, but they weren't talking to their beneficiaries about it. And just over half feel confident that those beneficiaries, those children or other family members who are going to receive the land, that they can maintain it, that they have the resources and capacity to continue to be forest landowners and manage and care for that land. And so these are some important touch points that we've been focusing on in this space of legacy planning. And I'm going to introduce another term here in a second, but kind of why we're there. How do we help people? And that's the purpose of this module. So we throw around a lot of different phrasing when we talk about this. And so I just wanted to kind of parse this out a little bit. So sometimes people use estate planning and legacy planning somewhat interchangeably. If you go back kind of to the fundamental definition, an estate plan is really that collection of documents, those tools that are going to detail how assets are going to be distributed. So a very simple estate plan would include a will, a power of attorney, someone to make decisions, and a healthcare power of attorney, someone to make medical decisions. When we kind of change this idea to legacy planning, and specifically forest legacy planning, we're including those aspects of estate planning, but we're also thinking about the transfer of the stewardship ethic. And so it's the legal, financial, and resource management objectives that the current owner has to guide the stewardship of the resources into the future. There's a new phrase that's out there that perhaps resonates with this audience, and this is this idea of conservation-based estate planning. It comes to us from our colleagues at the University of Massachusetts, and the idea is that it is using the toolkit of estate planning, using the transfer of the stewardship ethic from forest legacy planning, but really thinking about making the land somewhat primary and getting as much undeveloped land to the new owner in as big an ownership as possible. That can happen in a space where it's going to a family member or someone not. So the idea is that in that conservation-based estate planning is including land protection or land conservation tools in addition to the estate planning tools to facilitate that transfer and ensuring the land stays intact. And so all credit to University of Massachusetts, but it's a concept that I think really resonates with folks who may be interested in this carbon and climate education space as well, because it really thinks about different ways to keep that land intact and functional. So when someone is talking about conservation-based estate planning or forest legacy planning, there are things that we have to consider, and there are decisions that have to be made about the land, and there are decisions that have to be made about that next owner. So the land decisions include things like, is someone going to allow active and adaptive management? What does that look like? Would the current owner, how do they feel about ideas about parcelization and development? Are they okay with leaving those options on the table for their beneficiaries, or would they want to prevent that? And we know that from our work that many landowners who espouse a really strong stewardship ethic want to see the land stay intact. And so that idea of the land being subdivided and sold or developed after their passing and future generations is really problematic for some people. It includes questions about how do we maintain access? Are there cabins there, or other resources that people will facilitate people taking advantage of being on the land, managing the land? And then sometimes ideas about protection, long-term protection through things like conservation easements or using some of the conservation restriction tools that are linked to things like carbon programs. And I'll talk about that in a second. When you think about the future owner, the next owner decisions, part of the estate planning process is really being concrete and tangible about what that looks like. So if you know that you want a future owner to be family member, is an inheritance the best process, or perhaps a bargain sale or some other means of transferring that land. If you're looking at inheritance, are you passing it to one beneficiary or multiple beneficiaries? And how well do they get along? How prepared are they to be owners? In that buyer space, we know of many landowners who have known who the next owner was going to be and facilitated a process through their planning to make the land affordable to that known buyer. Or putting protections, tools, or conservation restrictions in such a way that the next owner is kind of ensured that they will practice a good force and practice a good stewardship ethic because of some of the restrictions placed on the property. So these are all things that you have to think about. There's a whole bunch of work that goes into estate planning, and there are things like being very clear and concrete about your goals. One of the ideas that I talk about a lot, and it came from that book that I mentioned about the family philanthropies, is this idea of a mission statement. And we adapted it to be a land mission statement. What is some overarching goal of the land that you have that people can listen to and hear and understand and maybe work towards? Um, Often, so much of us, we think that we know what we want to do. It's all in our head, but we don't make it concrete and write it down. So really thinking about what are your goals for the land and making them concrete. I can't tell you how many children of current owners talk about the importance of having that understanding of what their parents or aunts, uncles, grandparents were hoping for the land, how important that is to them as they inherit or buy the land. What stewardship resources do you have? Are you working with consulting foresters? Does your service forester, your state service forester work with you? Have you used cost share programs from the Natural Resources Conservation Service? Have you signed contracts with organizations? And really good maps. What do you have? What's on that land? So really, being real clear and tangible about what that looks like. But then the other part of it is preparing those folks who you plan to come after, especially if they're known. Are you talking to them? Are you part of that quarter of the landowners who are frequently talking to them? Or are you part of that quarter who have never mentioned it to them that they are going to become the future owners? And then some really real and concrete assessment of their abilities. Do they have the time and resources? Do they feel that they are competent and confident in taking on that responsibility? What's their history of engagement? Their multiples, can they work together? And then how can you help them? Are resources missing? How can you create some resources that'll help them? How can you send them through trainings or give them those connections to do well by the land? When we think about transferring land across generation, we think about different tools for transfer. So we have to think in the space of direct ownership, which is essentially names on deeds, or indirect ownership, which includes putting the land and those assets of the land into a legal structure like a partnership or a trust or a limited liability company, LLC, that lets the land kind of be its own entity. And there are pros and cons to all of these, but these are some things that you have to think about. And these are where the resources like estate planning attorneys, accountants, certified financial planners come in to help advise that process. We also encourage people who are in this space to talk to their consulting forester, to have that good relationship, that really concrete idea of what the land is, what the forest is, its value, and not just economic value, but its ecological value, and all those special places, that those are well articulated. Sometimes a family mediator is important to this process, but there are resources out there to help. And these are just some examples of the things that have to be thought about. When we think about long-term conservation, and again, this is a pretty high-level overview of this process, there are different tools out there. So conservation easements are essentially a tool wherein in the bundle of rights a landowner has, included in like the right to farm or the right to practice forestry, there's also the right to subdivide and sell and the right to develop the land. A conservation easement removes the rights to subdivide and sell off parts of the land and the right to develop. So you essentially sever those rights. So a conservation easement is attached to a deed for in perpetuity, essentially. But depending upon your state, different states have defined perpetuity differently. In Pennsylvania, it's forever. Some other states, it's 99 years. Another state, it's 3 generations. But this idea that the land is somewhat protected from that subdivision and development for a period of time, depending upon the state. Um, Conservation easements, that's where the land trust and land conservancy community get involved, and they monitor the easement. They ensure that the current and future owners are abiding by that agreement. And so there's kind of a third party that's involved in all that. Conservation restrictions are things like long-term leases, for example, a long-term carbon, voluntary carbon program, which you all have been learning about through some of the other modules. Those long-term leases are also some tools to support that long-term conservation, sometimes across generations. The caveat here is when you're looking at voluntary carbon programs, especially those that use the delay harvest strategy for carbon, at the current moment, here in 2025, when we're recording this, there is a measure of risk associated as they try to create those contracts. And so, in some cases, land that is already protected through conservation easement may not be as highly desirable or may not meet the criteria for some of these voluntary carbon programs. So that's just an important caveat to understand that at this moment, with some of the current programs, things are always evolving, and those protection strategies could be mutually beneficial. So perhaps things will change there. There are other legal tools that support long-term conservation. Some of those indirect ownership tools that I mentioned earlier can be a strategy, but it really depends on how they're written. So these are important things to think about. We've been doing a lot of work in this space. A colleague of mine, Paul Roth, and others, Paul did his PhD in this work. And so this is a diagram from his degree, from his dissertation, wherein he described the process of what it takes to get to a successful conservation-based estate plan. And there are, to be honest, a lot of off-ramps. It is a consuming process. It is an engaged process. It's not something people can do on their own. It involves landowner work, and it involves engaging professionals to help make this happen. And so we just have to kind of recognize that it is a complex space. But for those people who have done it, they have reported, a sense of ease and comfort, and their family expressing gratitude that they aren't going to have to worry about it. They know the land is important to the owner, and they aren't going to have to worry about it when they are no longer with us. So we do recognize that this process of legacy planning does involve extended periods of time. It can be a lengthy multi-year process. It involves a lot of work on the landowner's part. It involves engaging the family and preparing them or not, and choosing that, whether they're available or even if they're not available, kind of just making those decisions. There is the professional engagement, and that professional engagement does come at a cost. However, we do know that those benefits do often outweigh that cost, but it is something to be prepared for. And so those are just kind of some important things to think about. There's been a lot of work in this space since about 2009, 2010. A number of states especially the Eastern US, have been working in this space. So I offer a website that takes you to our Pennsylvania work, but you can find, we have links to other states there too. So one of the things that in our work with landowners we heard was they really wanted a guide. What does this process look like? And so Massachusetts started us off with a tool called Your Land, Your Legacy. So it's a publication. We then got a grant and adapted that publication for numerous other states. Right now, I think we're at 15 other states. It's been rewritten and branded for the other states. Many of us use the phrase, it's your legacy, for various reasons. So you can Google that and your state's name, and you're going to find this resource that gives you an overview of what that process is like. A second tool is called Their Land, Their Legacy, and it's really written kind of for those people who serve in supporting roles for landowners. So they're advisors, they're consulting foresters, they're service foresters, sometimes they're financial planners, municipal officials. How can we support landowners through that process? In Pennsylvania, when we adapted our version, we included some of the work that Paul had done around the conservation-based estate planning and the process to get there. So we've added a paragraph in our Pennsylvania version. But again, it's a tool to just describe the process and help people feel comfortable. We also have across 15 states legacy planning stories. One of the things landowners told us was they wanted to understand how other people had done it. So these stories are case studies of different landowners in different states who chose different tools, who chose different pathways, who have different family situations, so that people can see how other people like them made decisions about the future of their land. So offer those as resources. So why is this module included? Well, we recognize that forest land is at great risk when it changes hands. Decisions about conservation, subdivision development, or the potential for degrading practices can happen. We know that as we think about the current owners who have a really strong stewardship ethic, they really want someone to carry on their work. And so really that idea of connecting those conservation and values and putting them in a concrete plan thinking becomes a measure of protection to keep forests as forests. And so this legacy planning is a tool to help create that concrete plan. So the reflection question for you is, what are your plans for your land after you? And I hope that this presentation provokes some thoughts in that space. So with that, thank you. If you're watching this video on YouTube, we encourage you to check out this free online course that this module is part of. If you're taking the course, please complete the final evaluation survey to provide us feedback and to get your credit. So with that, I'll say thank you.